Aisha sat on the balcony of her family's grand estate, staring at the sprawling gardens below. The scent of freshly bloomed jasmine filled the evening air, but tonight, it did nothing to calm her restless heart. At 22, she was everything her parents had hoped for, brilliant, beautiful, and poised to take over her mother's fashion empire. But none of that mattered now. Her heart belonged to someone forbidden. Kwame. A housekeeper. She first noticed him a year ago when he joined the staff as a cleaner. Unlike the others, he carried himself with quiet confidence. He didn't shrink in the presence of wealth, nor did he act subservient beyond what was expected of him. There was something about him that intrigued her, something about the way he moved, the way he spoke. He wasn't just another worker trying to make a living, he had ambition, intelligence, and a sense of dignity that went beyond his position. Aisha never expected to fall for him. It had started as harmless curiosity, then admiration, then something more. Late-night encounters in the kitchen, stolen glances in the hallway, whispered conversations in the garden. They were careful, but love had a way of slipping through even the most guarded walls. The more she learned about him, the harder she fell. Kwame wasn't just some servant, they were equals in mind and spirit. He had dreams of his own, plans to start a business, to create something of his own rather than live at the mercy of the wealthy. His intelligence shone through in every conversation, his words filled with passion, determination, and warmth. But they lived in different worlds. And those worlds were about to collide. One evening, after the household had settled in for the night, Aisha found herself slipping out of her bedroom, her silk robe tied loosely around her waist. She had done this before, venturing into the back garden where Kwame often worked late, tidying up after the day's labor. She found him near the stone fountain, his sleeves rolled up, revealing strong arms as he lifted a heavy bag of garden waste. The warm glow of the setting sun made his deep brown skin shine, and for a moment, she just watched him. "You shouldn't be here, Aisha," Kwame said without looking up. He had always been aware of her presence, as if he could sense her before seeing her. She stepped closer, the dewy grass cool beneath her bare feet. "And if I want to be?" He sighed, finally turning to face her. His eyes, warm and deep, held a mixture of longing and concern. "You know how dangerous this is." "I don't care." Her voice was firm, unwavering. She had spent her entire life doing what was expected of her, but with Kwame, she wanted to be free. She wanted to be herself, not the poised and perfect daughter her parents had sculpted her into, but the woman who laughed freely, who dreamed without limits, who loved without fear. Kwame hesitated, his fingers tightening around the cloth of his work shirt. "If they find out." "They won't." She reached out, her fingers grazing his wrist. "Not if we're careful." His resolve broke. In that moment, the weight of status, of expectation, of fear melted away. He reached out, his fingers brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. "Then let's not care together." And just like that, the world beyond them ceased to exist. Days turned into weeks, and their stolen moments became more frequent. Late-night conversations in the quiet corners of the house. Secret touches when no one was watching. He told her about his past, about his family, about his struggles. He had grown up in the slums of Lagos, the eldest of 4 siblings. His father had died young, leaving his mother to fend for them. Kwame had taken whatever jobs he could to support his family, but he had never let go of his dreams. "I want to own something," he told her one night as they sat beneath the mango tree in the backyard. "Something that's mine. A business, a home. I don't want to spend my life serving others, living under their mercy." She admired him even more for that. He wasn't content with the role society had given him, he wanted to rise above it. And she wanted to be by his side when he did. But secrets never stayed hidden for long. One evening, as Aisha laughed at something Kwame said, she heard a sharp intake of breath behind her. She turned and froze. Her mother stood there, fury written all over her face. "What is this?" Mrs. Adeyemi's voice was sharp, venomous. Kwame immediately took a step back, bowing his head in respect. "Madam, I—" "Silence," she snapped. Her cold eyes shifted to Aisha. "Is this how you repay everything we've given you? By throwing yourself at a common houseboy?" Aisha clenched her fists. "He's not just a housekeeper. He's a man. A man I love." The words were out before she could stop them. Her mother's face paled before turning red with rage. "This ends now. You will marry the man we have chosen for you." Aisha's stomach twisted. She had heard the whispers, the son of a powerful businessman was interested in her. But she had ignored them, thinking her parents wouldn't force her into something against her will. She was wrong. Kwame looked at her, his face filled with sorrow and love. "Aisha." "No." She turned back to her mother. "I won't marry him." Mrs. Adeyemi's lips curled into a cruel smile. "Then you are no longer our daughter." The words hit harder than a slap. Aisha's breath hitched, but she lifted her chin. "So be it." Her mother's expression flickered, perhaps she thought Aisha would beg. When she didn't, her mother turned on her heel and stormed away. Kwame stepped closer, gripping Aisha's trembling hands. "Are you sure?" Tears welled up, but she nodded. "I choose love." Her father was the next to intervene. He called her into his office, his expression unreadable. "Aisha," he said calmly, pouring himself a glass of whiskey. "Do you understand what you're doing?" "Yes." He took a slow sip, studying her. "You are throwing away everything. Your inheritance. Your future." "No. I'm choosing my own future." Her father exhaled, setting his glass down. "Then leave." The finality of his words sent a chill through her. "You're disowning me?" "We are setting you free," he said. "If you walk out of this house with that boy, you will never step foot in here again." Aisha swallowed the lump in her throat. "If that's the price of love, then I will pay it." And with that, the life she had always known shattered. As she packed her bags that night, Kwame stood beside her, his eyes filled with worry. "I never wanted this for you," he whispered. "I did," she said, forcing a small smile. "Because now I am free." Hand in hand, they walked out of the house, stepping into the unknown. The cold night air bit at Aisha's skin as she and Kwame walked away from the Adeyemi estate. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of her parents' rejection pressing down on her shoulders. She clutched her small suitcase tightly, her fingers trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer gravity of what she had just done. She had walked away from everything she had ever known. Kwame squeezed her hand as they reached the gate. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. She looked up at him, trying to muster a smile, but all she could do was nod. Truthfully, she didn't know how to feel. Her heart ached for the family that had cast her aside, but at the same time, she felt an odd sense of liberation. She was free. Free to love, free to choose her own path. But what now? They had nowhere to go. Kwame had a small rented room in a crowded part of the city, barely big enough for one person, let alone two. He had offered to take her there, but Aisha shook her head. "No," she said. "Let's find a place together." Kwame hesitated. "Aisha, I don't have much money. I was saving to start my business, but—" "We'll figure it out," she said firmly. Together. That night, they found shelter in a small guest house. It wasn't anything like the luxury she had grown up in. The bed was stiff, the room smelled of old wood, and the walls were thin enough to hear the murmurs of other guests. But when she lay beside Kwame, his arms wrapped around her, she felt safer than she ever had in her parents' mansion. Still, reality loomed over them. The next morning, Aisha woke up to the sound of Kwame moving around the room. He was already dressed, buttoning up his shirt. "I have to go to work," he said, his voice apologetic. "They'll fire me if I don't show up." Aisha sat up, rubbing her eyes. "I understand." He knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "Stay here. I'll figure things out. We'll find a place soon." Aisha nodded, but as he left, a sinking feeling settled in her chest. For the first time in her life, she was truly alone. The first few weeks were harder than Aisha had imagined. She had no job, no money, and no experience living outside the world of luxury. Every time she stepped outside, she felt the stares of people who recognized her from society magazines. Some whispered, some pointed, some pitied her. Her phone, once constantly buzzing with calls and messages, was now silent. Her so-called friends had abandoned her the moment she defied her parents. Not a single one reached out. The only person who stood by her was Kwame. He worked tirelessly, taking extra shifts to afford rent for a tiny one-bedroom apartment in a noisy, bustling neighborhood. It was nothing like the lavish comfort she had once known, but it was home. They ate simple meals together, sat on the small balcony talking about their dreams, and found joy in the little things. Yet, as much as she loved Kwame, reality was unforgiving. She needed to find work. Aisha had never worked a day in her life. She had studied business management at one of the finest universities, but her degree meant nothing without experience. She walked from office to office, dropping her CV at companies that barely glanced at her. Some rejected her outright, others promised to call back but never did. It was humiliating, exhausting, and soul-crushing. At night, she cried in Kwame's arms. "I thought I was capable," she whispered. "But I don't even know how to survive without my family's money." Kwame kissed her forehead. "You are capable," he said. "You just have to find your own way." Then, one day, an opportunity came. A small fashion boutique in town was looking for an assistant. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was minimal, but Aisha didn't hesitate. She walked in, introduced herself, and begged for the job. The owner, a middle-aged woman named Madame Folake, looked at her skeptically. "Aren't you the Adeyemi girl?" Aisha's stomach twisted. "I was." Folake studied her for a long moment, then finally nodded. "Fine. Be here tomorrow at 8. For the first time in weeks, Aisha felt a spark of hope. The job was harder than she had expected. She spent hours folding clothes, organizing shelves, and running errands. She had blisters on her feet from standing all day, and by the time she got home, exhaustion weighed her down. But she didn't complain. Kwame noticed the change in her. One evening, as they sat on the floor of their apartment eating rice and beans, he took her hand. "I'm proud of you." Aisha smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. "For what?" "For proving to yourself that you can do this." She squeezed his hand. "I couldn't do it without you." Kwame leaned in, brushing his lips against hers. "We're in this together," he murmured. And for the first time since she left home, Aisha truly believed that. But happiness was short-lived. One evening, Aisha arrived at work to find the boutique in chaos. Madame Folake was shouting at two policemen, her face red with anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't just shut us down." The officers ignored her, taping a seized by court order notice on the front door. Aisha's stomach dropped. "What's going on?" she asked one of her co-workers. "The owner's in debt," the woman whispered. "She lost everything." Aisha felt sick. Just when she had found stability, it was ripped away again. That night, she walked home in a daze. When she reached the apartment, she collapsed onto the couch. Kwame immediately rushed to her side. "What's wrong?" She swallowed hard. "I lost my job." His expression softened, and he pulled her into his arms. "We'll figure it out," he whispered. But she wasn't sure they could. Days passed, and money grew tighter. Kwame was already working multiple jobs, and Aisha couldn't find another one fast enough. They started skipping meals, cutting corners, and selling whatever they could to survive. One evening, as they lay on their mattress in the small room, Kwame turned to her. "Aisha." She looked at him, sensing his hesitation. "What is it?" His jaw tightened. "If this is too hard for you, I won't hold it against you if you go back to your family." Aisha stared at him, shock and hurt washing over her. "What?" "I don't want you to suffer because of me," he said quietly. "I love you too much for that." Tears welled up in her eyes. "You think I regret choosing you?" "I don't know," he admitted. I don't want you to resent me." Aisha sat up, cupping his face in her hands. "Kwame, listen to me. I chose you. I chose us. I don't care if we have nothing. I love you." He exhaled shakily, pressing his forehead against hers. "I love you too." And in that moment, she knew, no matter how hard things got, she would never give up on them. But fate had other plans. The next morning, as Aisha stepped outside, she froze. Standing near the apartment gate was a man in a sharp suit, his face eerily familiar. Her father's personal assistant. He spotted her and walked up, his expression unreadable. "Miss Adeyemi." Her throat went dry. "What do you want?" He pulled out an envelope and handed it to her. "Your parents have made a decision. Open it." Aisha hesitated before slowly unfolding the paper inside. As she read the words, her heart pounded. Her parents had officially disinherited her. She had lost everything. Forever. Aisha's hands trembled as she held the letter. The words burned into her mind, each sentence slashing through her like a blade. "By the authority of the Adeyemi family and legal representatives, you are hereby stripped of any inheritance, financial support, or claim to family assets. Any attempts to return will be considered trespassing." The letter was signed by her father's lawyer, but the words were unmistakably her parents'. This was final. They had truly erased her from their lives. The assistant cleared his throat. "I was instructed to deliver this personally." Aisha lifted her gaze, trying to appear strong. "Tell them I don't need anything from them." The man hesitated. "They expected you to say that." He sighed. "I'm sorry, Miss Adeyemi." Aisha didn't respond. She turned and walked back into the apartment, shutting the door behind her. She stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding. Disowned. Cut off. It was one thing to walk away from her family, it was another to have the door slammed in her face. Forever. Kwame found her sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the letter. He took one look at her face and immediately knelt beside her. "Aisha?" Wordlessly, she handed him the paper. He read it carefully, his expression hardening. "They really did this?" She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Kwame took a deep breath, then looked her in the eyes. "Aisha, this doesn't change anything." Tears welled up in her eyes. "It changes everything, Kwame. I have nothing." He cupped her face gently. "You have me." A sob escaped her lips, and she collapsed into his arms. He held her tightly, his warmth anchoring her as she cried. "We'll get through this," he murmured. "Together." Aisha clung to him, her heart swelling with love and fear. But love alone wouldn't put food on the table. The fight for survival. With Aisha now completely cut off, their financial situation grew dire. Kwame continued working long shifts, but it wasn't enough. Aisha searched for work every day, knocking on doors, handing out resumes, only to be met with rejection after rejection. Days turned into weeks. Their savings dwindled. The landlord began asking about rent. One evening, Aisha sat at the table, staring at their nearly empty pantry. "Kwame, we need another plan," she said. Kwame sighed, rubbing his face. "I know. I've been thinking about it." "What about your business idea?" she asked. "The cleaning company you wanted to start?" Kwame shook his head. "I don't have the capital for that." Aisha bit her lip. "What if we start small? Just the two of us? We clean houses ourselves, build a reputation, and expand when we have enough money." Kwame looked at her, considering. "You'd do that?" She nodded. "I'm not afraid of hard work." A slow smile spread across his face. "Then let's do it." Building from nothing. The next morning, they printed flyers and walked through neighborhoods, offering cleaning services. Most people turned them away. Some laughed in Aisha's face, recognizing her as the former heiress. But they refused to give up. Then, after a week of trying, they got their first client, an elderly woman who needed help tidying her home. They worked tirelessly, scrubbing, mopping, and dusting every corner. When they finished, the woman was so impressed that she recommended them to her friends. Slowly, calls started coming in. They cleaned apartments, offices, and even a small restaurant. The money wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them afloat. And through it all, Kwame and Aisha grew closer. At night, they collapsed into bed, exhausted but happy. They laughed about the stubborn stains they had battled during the day. Kwame kissed her forehead, telling her how proud he was. For the first time in months, Aisha felt hope. An unexpected encounter. One day, as Aisha walked through town handing out more flyers, she heard someone call her name. "Aisha?" She turned and froze. It was Tund, an old family friend. He had been close to her father, a businessman who often attended their lavish parties. He looked her up and down, his expression shifting from shock to pity. "Is that really you?" Aisha straightened her back. "Yes. I heard what happened," Tund said. "You left your family for a housekeeper?" She clenched her jaw. "His name is Kwame." Tund smirked. "And now you're handing out flyers?" Aisha's stomach twisted, but she refused to let him see her discomfort. "I'm building something for myself," she said firmly. Tund chuckled. "You could have had everything, Aisha. Instead, you chose struggle." She met his gaze. "I chose love." He shook his head. "Suit yourself. But when you get tired of this life, you know where to find me." Aisha turned away without another word. As she walked home, she couldn't shake the feeling of anger and doubt. Had she really made the right choice? Love through hardship. That night, as she sat beside Kwame in their tiny apartment, she studied his face. The man who had given her everything, even when he had nothing. "Do you ever regret this?" she asked suddenly. Kwame looked up from his meal. "Regret what?" "Choosing me. This life." His eyes softened. "Never." Aisha swallowed. "Even though we're struggling?" Kwame took her hands in his. "Aisha, I don't need money or luxury to be happy. I just need you." Tears pricked her eyes. He leaned in, pressing a kiss against her lips. "We'll make it. I promise." She nodded, believing him. Because despite everything, love was the one thing they had in abundance. But fate wasn't done testing them yet. A cruel twist of fate. Just as things were starting to look up, disaster struck. One evening, Kwame returned home late, his face pale. "Aisha," he said, voice tight. She stood quickly. "What is it?" He exhaled shakily. "I lost my job." Aisha's breath caught. What? How? They're downsizing, he said bitterly. They let me go. She felt the walls closing in around her. But we barely have enough as it is. I know. Silence filled the room. Aisha sat down, pressing her hands to her face. They had worked so hard, fought so many battles, only for life to knock them down again. She looked up at Kwame, who was staring at the floor. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes that scared her. Defeat. Kwame sat in silence, his hands clenched into fists. Aisha had seen him face countless challenges, but never had she seen this look in his eyes, utter defeat. She reached for his hand. We'll figure something out. Kwame let out a bitter chuckle. How, Aisha? I just lost the only stable income we had. We barely make enough from the cleaning jobs, and rent is due in 2 weeks. Aisha's mind raced. They had worked so hard to build something for themselves. Was it all slipping away now? Then, a thought struck her. What if we take a risk, she said slowly. Kwame looked up. What kind of risk? She took a deep breath. Expanding our business. We invest whatever we have left into it. Get proper equipment, reach out to bigger clients. If we succeed, we won't have to rely on anyone for work again. Kwame hesitated. That's a huge gamble, Aisha. What if it doesn't work? Aisha squeezed his hand. Then we keep trying. We didn't come this far to give up now. Something shifted in his eyes. Hope. Finally, he nodded. All right. Let's do it. The hustle begins. Aisha and Kwame put everything they had into their business. They used their last bit of savings to buy proper cleaning supplies and uniforms. Aisha designed professional business cards and set up an online presence, advertising their services aggressively. But clients didn't come easily. They spent days knocking on doors, making calls, and handing out flyers. Rejection after rejection stung, but they refused to give up. Then, finally, a breakthrough. A high-end office building agreed to let them clean on a trial basis. If they did well, they'd secure a contract. This was their chance. Kwame and Aisha spent the entire night cleaning, making sure everything was spotless. When the manager inspected the next morning, she was impressed. You've got the contract, she said. Aisha and Kwame exchanged stunned glances before breaking into relieved smiles. They had done it. Love amidst the chaos. With steady work coming in, things slowly improved. Aisha and Kwame worked tirelessly, but they also found moments to cherish each other. Late at night, they sat on their small balcony, watching the city lights. Kwame pulled Aisha close. You know, I wouldn't change a thing, he murmured. Aisha smiled. Not even the struggles? He shook his head. Because every struggle brought me closer to you. She kissed him softly, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Love was their foundation. No amount of hardship could break it. A shadow from the past. Just when things seemed to be settling, Aisha received an unexpected visitor. Her brother. She hadn't seen him since the day she walked out of her family's mansion. He stood at the door, dressed in an expensive suit, his expression unreadable. Aisha. She folded her arms. What do you want? He sighed. Can we talk? Reluctantly, she stepped aside. They sat at the small dining table, the contrast between their lives painfully obvious. I heard about your business, he said. You're doing well. Aisha tensed. Why do you care? Her brother hesitated. Mother isn't well. Aisha's breath caught. She's been asking about you, he continued. She regrets what happened. A mix of emotions swirled inside Aisha, anger, sadness, longing. She disowned me, she said coldly. Now she wants me back. Her brother sighed. She was wrong. But she's still our mother. Aisha's heart ached. Part of her wanted to see her mother again. But could she forgive so easily? I'll think about it, she said finally. Her brother nodded. That's all I ask. As he left, Aisha felt a storm brewing inside her. Would she go back? And if she did, at what cost? Aisha couldn't shake the conversation with her brother. For so long, she had told herself she didn't care what her family thought. She had convinced herself she had moved on. But now, knowing her mother was unwell, a part of her, however small, felt torn. Are you going to see her? Kwame asked later that night. Aisha sighed. I don't know. She turned her back on me. My father did too. Kwame reached for her hand. Aisha, you don't have to go for them. Do it for yourself. If you need closure, take it. But don't let them make you feel small again. She gazed into his eyes, the love and wisdom in them giving her strength. He had always seen her for who she truly was, not for what she had or what she had lost. Maybe it was time to see her mother one last time. Facing the past. The next morning, Aisha stood in front of the grand Adeyemi estate, her heart pounding. The gates she had once walked through so freely now felt like barriers to a life she no longer belonged to. She stepped inside, memories flooding her, lavish parties, strict etiquette lessons, the suffocating pressure to be the perfect daughter. A maid led her to her mother's room. Aisha inhaled deeply before stepping inside. Her mother lay in bed, looking frilier than Aisha had ever seen her. Yet, even in her weakness, she carried an air of elegance. Her eyes widened at the sight of Aisha. You came. Aisha swallowed hard. I heard you weren't well. Her mother studied her, taking in her simple but clean outfit, the quiet confidence in her posture. You look different. I am different, Aisha said. A tense silence followed. Finally, her mother sighed. Aisha, I was wrong. The words stunned her. I should have never disowned you, her mother continued. Your father was furious, and I let his pride dictate our decisions. But you are my daughter, and no amount of anger can change that. Aisha's throat tightened. Why now? Why not before? Her mother looked down. Because I was too proud. Too afraid to admit I had lost you. She met Aisha's gaze. I don't expect you to forgive me. I only want you to know that I regret it. Aisha's heart ached. She had spent so long resenting her mother, building a wall between them. But now, seeing the remorse in her eyes, she realized something. She didn't need revenge. She didn't need to hold on to the pain anymore. I can't forget what happened, Aisha said softly. But I can move forward. Her mother's eyes glistened. That's all I could ask for. Aisha reached out, hesitantly taking her mother's hand. A silent truce. She had her closure. The sweetest victory. As Aisha left the estate, she felt lighter. She didn't need her family's money. She didn't need their approval. She had built her own life. And she was proud of it. When she returned home, Kwame was waiting. She ran into his arms, breathing him in. How did it go? He asked. She smiled softly. I got what I needed. Kwame brushed a curl from her face. I'm proud of you. Tears welled in her eyes. I couldn't have done this without you. He cupped her face, his voice gentle. Aisha, you were always strong. You just needed someone to remind you. She pulled him into a deep kiss, pouring every ounce of love and gratitude into it. No mansion, no wealth, no inheritance could ever compare to the love they had built. Aisha had lost everything, only to gain something far greater. A life she had chosen. A love that was hers. And in the end, that was the greatest karma of all.